The Fisherman's Rest, in 1909, was the kind of pub that collected shadows and secrets in its corners, where the North Sea wind rattled windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since Victoria sat on the throne. Angus MacLeod found Tommy MacPherson hunched at the far end of the bar, clutching a bottle of whiskey with hands that trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. The departing lighthouse keeper's eyes were sunken deep into a face that looked decades older than his 50 years. For a few quick moments, thoughts of unremembered dreams filled Angus's head. Almost as if he had dreamed Tommy. There was a familiarity to him, an unknown that was somehow known. The skin pulled tight across his cheekbones like weathered leather. Dark circles pooled beneath his eyes so deep they looked like bruises, and his yellowed fingernails had bitten to the quick. His clothes hung loose on his frame as if he'd lost weight too quickly, and a constant tremor ran through his shoulders. The smell of decay also clung to Tommy, not the honest rot of fish and seaweed, but something older, far older, that brought to mind ancient shipwrecks and the things that made homes in their waterlogged corridors. When Angus sat down beside him to discuss the lighthouse handover, Tommy barely seemed to register his presence. His bloodshot eyes remained fixed on something distant that only he could see, and his cracked lips moved in silent words between sips of whiskey. Ravencraig Lighthouse rose like a bone-white finger from the most treacherous stretch of Scotland's northeastern coast. Local fishing boats gave it a wide berth, even in calm seas. The old-timers in the village spoke of it only in whispers, and then, never after dark. They hung strands of kelp and sea-smooth stones above their doors when storms approached, though none would say why. After what felt like hours of silence, Tommy finally spoke. His Aberdeen accent thick with desperation, his hand shook so badly he had to grip the bottle with both hands to pour another drink. "You want to be mindful of the storm light," he croaked, still staring into middle distance. "Sometimes it shows you things best left unseen, things that were familiar faces." His voice cracked as he drained his glass. Then he fell silent again, shoulders hunched against some invisible weight, fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on the sticky bar top. The next morning when Angus arrived for his first shift, Tommy was nowhere to be found. He'd left everything behind in the keeper's quarters, clothes, photographs, even his wallet. Immediately, the dreams began. Every night, every shift, Tommy's weathered face staring back at him from storm-tossed waves, mouth stretched impossibly wide, screaming words that Angus could never quite hear over the howling wind. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more urgent, until Angus would wake with the taste of salt water in his mouth and the sensation of cold, wet hands pulling at his ankles. Angus should have run then. Should have wondered why the lighthouse had gone through 4 keepers in just as many years. Should have asked why the villagers crossed themselves whenever the lighthouse was mentioned, or why they hurried past with averted eyes when he ventured into town for supplies. Only old Margaret at the post office would speak to him, and then only to warn him. "The light keeps burning," she'd said, her eyes fixed on something beyond his shoulder. "But every flame casts shadows, and it's in the shadows that they wait." The answer to those cryptic warnings came during his first storm. That September gale had blown in from the northeast, driving waves against the rocky headland with such force that spray reached the lantern room, 80 feet above the surging sea. As Angus trimmed the wick, the glass of the lantern room vibrated with a frequency that made his skull ache, a deep resonance that seemed to echo the tremor he'd seen in Tommy's hands that night at the pub. Movement caught his eye through the rotating beam. He pressed his face to the glass, squinting through sheets of rain that seemed to flow upward against the window panes. The brass fittings of the lantern room had begun to tarnish before his eyes, patterns of green-black corruption spreading like frost. There, in the brief illumination between sweeps of light, sat a 3-masted schooner, her sails full despite the storm. She was beautiful, perfect, and impossible. No modern vessel carried that rigging, and no wooden ship could survive these seas, yet there she was, appearing and vanishing with each pass of the beam like a phantom caught in amber. At her helm stood Tommy, dressed in clothes from another century, his face now a mask of resigned acceptance as the beam swept past again and again. Angus saw the crew, dozens of men all wearing Tommy's face, all turning to stare at the lighthouse with the same empty eyes, their mouths moving in unison, and though no sound could penetrate the thick glass, Angus felt the words in his bones. "Your turn to feed it, keeper." The second storm came a fortnight later, driving harder than the first. The lighthouse's hum had grown deeper, resonating in Angus's chest like a distant whale song. When the beam swept across the waters this time, he saw something vast breach the surface. It rose like a mountain from the depths, its flesh pale and wrong with too many angles for any living thing. He caught only glimpses. A giant eye rolling in its socket, tentacles thick as tree trunks, and there, perched upon its bulk, Tommy again. But now his face seemed to ripple and flow like wax in a furnace, features sliding across bone as though searching for a new configuration. Angus fled down the spiral staircase to his quarters, where he pulled out the lighthouse logs. His hands shook with the same palsy he'd seen afflict Tommy as he read entries dating back to 1867, when Ravencraig first lit its lamp. Each keeper had seen the same progression, the ship, the creature, the figure. Each had seen their predecessors face in the storms. Every account ended after the seventh storm, and every new keeper had dreamed of their predecessor's face. The third storm brought true terror. The figure stood upon the water a quarter-mile out, impossible in its stillness, amid heaving seas. Each sweep of the light revealed it closer than before, as if it moved between flashes. Tommy's face had settled into something new, a thing of angles and shadows that hurt Angus's eyes to look upon. Between the sweeps of the beam, Angus could hear singing, old sea shanties in voices that were almost, but not quite, human. Angus caught his reflection in the lantern room glass. Dark circles had begun to form beneath his own eyes, and his hands shook as he gripped the rail, just like Tommy's had. The fourth storm brought the figure within 100 yards. Through the glass, Angus watched Tommy's features crack and peel away like burning paper, revealing something darker beneath, a void that seemed to swallow light itself. The singing grew louder, and now Angus could make out words in languages that had never existed on any human tongue. His clothes had begun to hang loose on his frame, just as Tommy's had that night in the pub. During the fifth storm, it reached the base of the lighthouse. Angus huddled in the lantern room, watching it circle the tower like a shark circling prey. The beam caught it with each rotation, and now that void face began to bubble and shift, trying to form new features, his features. It wasn't that Angus hadn't attempted to leave. He did, numerous times, and each time he would find himself back at the lighthouse, in the small cot, shaking, shivering, as if awaking from a fever dream. In the brief darkness between sweeps, Angus saw other faces pressing out from within it, mouths open in silent screams. He found himself biting his nails to the quick, tasting the blood and the salt. The sixth storm lasted 3 days. The figure climbed, moving against gravity up the sheer wall of the lighthouse. Angus watched in horror as it reached the gallery, pressing its face against the glass. In the darkness, that void face had become a perfect mirror of his own, save for the eyes, black pits that seemed to go on forever, holding the reflected light of long-dead stars. Tonight is the seventh storm. The figure is inside now, its footsteps echoing up the spiral stair with a sound like wet flesh on stone. The beam sweeps endlessly over the waves, and in its light, Angus sees dozens of vessels approaching through the tempest, ghost ships, all of them crewed by faces of keepers past. Tommy stands at the helm of the nearest, his face whole again but empty of anything human, beckoning with arms that seem too long and too fluid. As the steps grow closer, Angus makes his final, hurried log entry, his handwriting as shaky as Tommy's trembling hands had been. To whoever finds this, we're not meant to see what lies between the flashes of light in that fraction of darkness that holds all the world's horrors. The light must stay burning, no matter the cost. I understand now. We're not guardians. We're sustenance. The light doesn't keep ships safe from the rocks. It keeps something else away, something that grows stronger in the dark. But light casts shadows. And in those shadows it feeds. I see now why Tommy tried to run but couldn't run. But running doesn't matter. It will find us anyway. It's always been finding us. The pen falls. The log ends. The door opens. With a sound like a last dying breath. When the relief keeper arrives 2 days later, he finds the lantern room empty except for the logbook and a strange mark burned into the glass. A face caught in a silent screen, features already beginning to fade. In the small fishing village below Ravencraig Lighthouse, they say you can sometimes hear singing on storm nights, carried on the wind. Old, mostly forgotten sea shanties and voices that sound almost human. The locals hurry past with their heads down, making signs against evils. They know better than to look up at the light during storms. They know better than to ask why keepers come to Ravencraig before ever seeing a job posting, drawn by dreams of faces they shouldn't recognize. But the light keeps burning.